I regard it as an unusual moment in my own life when George Soros sued me personally for writing about him in the Toronto Sun. I had just joined the Toronto Sun, and this was months before the launch of the Sun News Network. And the newspaper made the decision to retract and apologize. I don't think they wanted to fight George Soros. I resisted that, but he literally was just hired by Sun News, and I was in no position to resist it. I've been interested in him ever since. I simply wrote what he told his own biographer, that he, when he was a teenage boy, for those of you who don't know, he was in Hungary and he was a Jew, even though him and his father really were, they abandoned their Jewishness. They spoke Esperanto at home. He was a very early, I guess you could say, globalist or transnationalist. And his father said, "We're going to get through this thing. You're a teenage boy. Do what you need to survive." And for a while, he would ride his bike around Budapest and hand the death notices to the Jews to show up to the train stations. And then later, his dad placed him with like a Nazi overseer who was confiscating Jewish property. You can't really blame a teenage boy for doing what his father says and for doing anything to survive the war. But it was fascinating in that clip on 60 Minutes, decades later, when he was asked, you did things to survive that would put anyone on the psychologist's couch forever. Do you have any remorse? And I think that's a fair question, not did you make the right decision when you were 15, but how do you feel now, decades later? And he told his biographers, and he said as much to 60 Minutes, that it was the most exciting time of his life and that he has no compunction about it. And it was, if he didn't do it, someone else would. It's like a market. He felt completely amoral. Here's a clip from 60 Minutes, just in case you don't know what I'm talking about.
When the Nazis occupied Budapest in 1944, George Soros' father was a successful lawyer. He lived on an island in the Danube and liked to commute to work in a rowboat. But knowing there were problems ahead for the Jews, he decided to split his family up. He bought them forged papers, and he bribed a government official to take 14-year-old George Soros in and swear that he was his Christian godson. But survival carried a heavy price tag. While hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were being shipped off to the death camps, George Soros accompanied his phony godfather on his appointed rounds, confiscating property from the Jews. These are pictures from 1944 of what happened to George Soros' friends and neighbors.
You're a Hungarian Jew who escaped the Holocaust by posing as a Christian.
Right.
And you watched lots of people get shipped off to the death camps.
Right. I was 14 years old. And I would say that that's when my character was made.
In what way?
That one should think ahead, one should understand and anticipate events, and one is threatened. It was a tremendous threat of evil. I mean, it was a very personal experience of evil.
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right. Yes.
I mean, that sounds like an experience that would send lots of people to the psychiatric couch for many, many years. Was it difficult?
Not at all. Not at all. Maybe as a child you don't see the connection, but it created no problem at all.
No feeling of guilt.
No.
For example, that I'm Jewish, and here I am watching these people go. I could just as easily be there. I should be there. None of that.
Well, of course, I could be on the other side, or I could be the one from whom the thing is being taken away. But there was no sense that I shouldn't be there, because that was, well, actually, funny way, it's just like in markets, that if I weren't there, of course I wasn't doing it, but somebody else would be taking it away anyhow. In other words, whether I was there or not, I was only a spectator. The property was being taken away. So I had no role in taking away that property. So I had no sense of guilt.
So the reason I mentioned George Soros is because I know a little bit about him and how he likes to censor. And I regret the fact that the son did bend the knee to him about a decade ago. But that made me curious, and forgive me for going on here, James. I just want to tell you a story. So when I heard that George Soros was working with Justin Trudeau on Canadian immigration policy, and George Soros has no connection to Canada. He's not a Canadian, doesn't live here. We filed an access to information request to our government asking for the background on this, because it was a government press release that Soros was basically the policy brains for Canada's immigration policy. Okay, government press release says this happens. We did an access to information request, and they said, no, we have no record of it. So we didn't believe that, and it was a 5-year battle for them to release the records. And at the end of our interview, I'll play Sheila's story showing that. And here's my point. I'm sorry to have such a long story, James, but there are so many conspiracy theories around George Soros that when the government announces that it's doing a policy, it's outsourcing Canadian immigration policy to George Soros's Open Society Foundations. And then when we ask for the paperwork behind that, they claim it does not exist. And 5 years later, we find out they were hiding it. That destroys trust in the entire institution of government. And it doesn't tamp down conspiracy theories. It gives them credence. Because I believe we have, in the story I just said, and we'll close this interview, but I'll show you what Sheila got in those records. When the government does secret business with George Soros and hides the proof of it for 5 years and has to be taken to task 5 years later by the Information Commissioner, how can you believe anything they say? And whether it's the American FBI, the American IRS, the American CIA, the Department of Defense, the NSA, or any Canadian institution, let alone our health institutions, I think that there is a large crisis. There is not a single institution I trust more now than I trusted 2 years ago, whether it's a COP or the College of Physicians and Surgeons. There is no institution I trust more now than I did 2 years ago. Maybe that's part of the plan, though, James.
You know, that's one of the things that I wonder and worry about, is that the crumbling of trust in our institutions, and because whether we like it or not, society actually is largely a product of its ability to trust its institutions, and that what its institutions are able to accomplish for it, at least an advanced society is. And when you dissolve trust in those, you create conditions in which change is easy to bring about one way or another. It's what Marxists would refer to as revolutionary conditions, or revolutionary moment. And that I share your destruction of trust in institutions. I even would hesitate, say that I were in a car accident or something and injured, I would hesitate to go to the hospital for fear that they might attempt to vaccinate me against my wishes, or, you know, something along these lines. And that's a tremendous loss of trust in an institution. And this kind of thing can be part of it's I think I saw the phrase in the media recently, this is an inflection point in history where things can be pushed in a particular direction, or they can go in some other direction, but things will not, I think, be able to continue as they were. I do know some pathways, so we don't end on such a dour note. I do know some pathways to where trust in institutions can be regained, though we have to be cautious. We see the CDC in the United States, for example, attempting this by suddenly telling us all kinds of things that people have known to be true about the pandemic for a year and a half. And now suddenly they realize it too, now that the Omicron variant or some, releases of information or exposés or whatever have forced their hand, decisions by federal judges or whatever have forced their hand. All of a sudden, things that people have known to be true, they were overcounting cases as, died with COVID versus died of COVID distinction, for example. They're releasing this information. A thorough house cleaning, though, of the people who have lied to us and misled us, meaning their removal from power, possibly their prosecution or lawsuits against them or the institutions that they represented is the first step, and then replacing them with people that we have good reason to believe are of higher integrity, while coming clean on many of these lies. In fact, ideally all of these lies that they've been telling us, is the first step to regaining that trust in institutions. So it is possible. I don't think that the people that are currently in power are going to be able to do that because it's too incriminating, just like we began this interview with the woman from the FBI who could not answer that question, who could not answer that question, who could not answer that question. And so, like I said, I think the pathway is going to be a lot of honesty, a lot of transparency, and a lot of house cleaning. Hopefully this starts to take place sooner rather than later. And of course, hopefully it all proceeds peacefully and through legal means, because this is a crucial moment in the literal sense of the word crucial in history throughout the West, where either we are facing a trajectory reminiscent of the 1930s in Europe, or we're facing a trajectory reminiscent of maybe the end of the 18th century in North America. And I'm on the side of freedom in that fight, whichever way it goes.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.